The US government is once again facing a shutdown. Infighting amongst Republicans is threatening a halt to this year's federal budget. But what will a shutdown mean for Americans? And can it be averted at the last minute? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The US is headed towards another government shutdown. Congress needs to agree on a new funding bill by the end of this month. And if not, thousands of federal employees will be sent home. That means curtailing many services and programmes. It's not the first time this has happened. American politicians seem to be constantly pushing budget negotiations to the brink. It's yet another sign of a deeply divided political landscape in Washington. We'll go to our panel in just a moment. First, this report from Fintan Monaghan.
The latest push in Congress to end the standoff on the federal budget has failed. A shutdown of the U.S. government is growing more likely with each passing day. Pressure is growing on House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to find a solution. Failure to do so could see him ousted from his position.
I don't think anybody wins a shutdown. Think for one moment what a shutdown does. Stops paying our troops. How do you have more leverage in that situation? I've watched shutdown after shutdown. Everybody loses.
The main opposition comes from hardline members of his own Republican Party. Many want major cuts in spending, and some may be willing to go all the way.
Give the American people the tax money back. That'll be a good thing. Will it take a couple of weeks of shutdown? Probably so. That's a fight we need to have right now. The American people are tired of the spending spree that we've had.
Congress has to extend funding before September 30th. After that, the government will have to shut down until more money is approved. That means non-essential staff are sent home. Some areas like law enforcement and air traffic control won't be affected. Other services would continue, but at reduced capacity. There's been more than 20 government shutdowns in the past 40 years. Most only lasted a couple of days, but more recent ones in 2013 and 2019 went on for weeks. The Fitch Ratings agency recently downgraded the U.S. credit rating, citing a steady deterioration in governance over the past 20 years. Deep divisions in Congress have long made it difficult to pass major spending legislation. And with politicians once again going to the brink on the budget, it seems likely Americans may be heading for yet another government shutdown. Fintan Monaghan for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now, and they're all joining us from the US. In Washington, Rina Shah, she's a Republican political strategist. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Thomas Gift, director at the Center on US Politics at University College London. And also in Washington, Elaine Kamarck, founding director at the Center for Effective Public Management at Brookings. A very warm welcome to each of you. Thomas, let's start with you, because the US has had more than 20 shutdowns in the last 40 years. We might be forgiven for thinking, here we go again, it's the same old story. But this time it does feel a little different, because it's quite hard to see how it can be resolved and what a final deal might look like.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that this isn't anything necessarily new. And as you noted, there have been 20 gaps in federal funding since 1976. And of course, most of these have happened under divided government. So I think that it's important to have a little bit of context whenever we're kind of viewing this situation. But at the same time, it does seem like we're at a real impasse. You know, with polarization as significant as it is very difficult to see how these two sides come to an agreement. I mean, to a large extent, Kevin McCarthy is being held hostage by the right flank of his party. That's also nothing new, and it's gone all the way back to when he assumed the speakership. We always knew that this was going to be difficult. I don't think anyone was under any illusions that it would not be. But you know, the fact that there haven't been any real breakthroughs is quite dispiriting, and more it looks like we're not going to reach an agreement by the end of the month.
Rina Shah, what do Republicans want to achieve? And I realise that's not a straightforward question because there's no one voice in the Republican Party at the moment. But broadly speaking, what are they trying to achieve here by stalling this bill, by not putting funding in place to stop a government shutdown?
In this moment, it's very important to recognize that the Republican Party is not united within the House caucus. You've got a faction of the hardliners, which is the House Freedom Caucus, the far right members, if you will, and then the more moderate, what are considered establishment members, folks who are by McCarthy's side, considered his allies, and those who have a very good memory of what the shutdown in 2013 looked like, just 10 years ago, that was put on because of the repeal of Obamacare. These are members, the more moderate ones, that don't want to shut down to make the Republicans look bad. Now, again, pulling back here, what you see is McCarthy in between a rock and a hard place. And it's been said for many weeks now that he is in this place, but how does he find his way out? One really clear exit at this moment in time is for him to work with Democrats. So as of right this moment, the Republicans in the House and the House itself has gone home for the weekend. So McCarthy's spending the weekend really slashing his own party's spending bills. And these revised bills he'll put on the floor when they convene next week, just 4 days before the deadline. This is sort of not unprecedented, but leaving many people biting their nails because this is so down to the wire. And we've seen this before come down to the wire in such a way. But again, right now, McCarthy's not showing any signs of wanting to work with Democrats. And that, again, after last week's failure to pass a continuing resolution, is his really only good strategy to avert the shutdown.
So what do the people on the far right of the Republican Party, Rina, want then? What is their agenda? Are they actually forcing a shutdown?
They would be forcing the shutdown, and they've had the same agenda since January, since they gave Kevin McCarthy the speakership. Now, they did so by McCarthy making many a concession, and one of the biggest ones we know was that it takes a single voice to go to the floor and call for removal of this speaker. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens before the end of this year, because these far-right members want to burn it all down. They want to see extreme cuts in spending. They want their demands met, one of them being no more aid to Ukraine. Now, again, on the world stage, it looks like American lawmakers are very united in having Ukraine's back, funding them, giving them what they need to push back on the invasion by Putin. But regardless of how you flip this thing, there are many Republicans in Congress, and a growing caucus of them, starting with that far-right faction, that don't want to see a blank check issued to Ukraine. And they've accused Biden of doing so, and they're accusing their own colleagues, McCarthy, and again, more moderate members, of doing that as well.
Elaine, it's hard to see a way forward, isn't it? Because you've got this agenda by the far-right Republicans for these massive spending cuts. Even if they get them passed through the House of Representatives, they will never pass the Senate.
No, that's right. And, you know, one of the interesting things, and I think the previous speaker made allusion to this, what the far right wants really is to burn the House down. Okay, and those are Kevin McCarthy's own words. I mean, there's a nihilistic attitude here. They're not going to get what they want. This is not productive. And to show you how unproductive it is, all you have to do is look at the Senate. The Senate has plenty of Republicans in there, some of them very, very conservative. But in fact, they have passed appropriations bills. They have made deals with Democrats, and you have a compromise situation in the Senate. So this is a lot of grandstanding, and for no particular good end, except for getting people's names in the paper. And the bottom line is, when this has happened before, the Republicans have lost. Okay, they lose when it comes to shutting down the government, and that's going to happen this time. So what everybody's waiting for is one of two things. Either somehow McCarthy will pull some of these extreme right-wingers into a more moderate position, or he will do what a lot of people think he may end up being forced to do, which is basically make a deal with the Democrats, get the bills passed, and then they will call for his ouster, and he will have to rely on Democratic votes to remain Speaker. And that's a dramatic scenario, and clearly one that he wants to avoid.
Thomas, which scenario do you see happening?
Well, you know, I think as this previous speaker noted, Kevin McCarthy is going to do everything he can not to have to compromise with Democrats. I think that would be probably lethal to his own future political prospects. But, at the same time, if it's between that and a government shutdown, he may feel ultimately like he has no choice. I think to some extent it is possible that some of these hard right Republicans are really doing this in a performative way, just like they performed during the vote over the House speakership, and that they'll ultimately fold because they will feel like that's the least of worst of two options. But at the same time, given their nihilistic attitude sort of towards the system, blow it all down, maybe that is what they prefer. Again, it does kind of get them in the headlines, and they're really not playing to a national audience. They're playing to the right-wing base. They're playing to their constituents in a particular district that are gerrymandered and where they have very safe seats and where their only challenge is likely to come in a primary from the even further right. So, a lot of this just comes down to the individual incentives, but as a whole, it's suboptimal for Congress.
And Rina, if Kevin McCarthy is pushed out of his speaker role, we were jumping ahead a bit more. We will bring it back to the government shutdown in a minute. But if he is pushed out of his speaker role, who would take his place? Who could get enough votes to take his place? Because as we've just heard, it was an arduous process even to get him into that job.
Right. There's no clear successor if McCarthy is no longer in the speakership. Certainly there are names that have been floated, but they don't really have a chance. They're not viable. One of those names is Congressman Matt Gaetz, a sort of younger member from the state of Florida, representing quite a rural area. I myself actually used to be a senior advisor to that office for his predecessor. And I can tell you that in the southern part of the United States, of course, it's very red, very Republican. But there are more people who are starting to see Congress for what it is. Its disapproval rating continues to climb, and they do see this performance politics as being sort of part and parcel with the era, but they are growing more and more frustrated with what Washington is not doing. So these members are not offering anything except for saying this person is an establishment hack, and they are working with Democrats, and you don't want that. So that is what Gaetz is proposing. He would like to try to take over the speakership from McCarthy, but he's just not a clear and viable option. So it would be quite humiliating for McCarthy and his allies. I mean, this comes at a time where Republicans need more support than ever. It's coming right on at what would I consider one of the longest cycles for president, and in a year where there's going to be real discussions and needs for Republicans to moderate on topics like abortion. So what the reality really looks like here is that McCarthy needs to do what, again, these far-right caucus members do not want him to do and ridicule him for doing, which is work with Democrats and bring spending measures to the floor next week and pass them. But again, he's taken sort of the option that is toughest, which is going for full-term spending options instead of these short-term spending options, which he could not get passed last week. And what this really does is highlight how bad a government shutdown would be for our country. It has wide-ranging effects in places like Alaska, for example. Senator Lisa Murkowski has said it would be detrimental to fishermen and people who rely on federal licenses for their livelihoods. Far-right members think that government shutdowns, federal government shutdowns, don't impact their constituents, but the very reality is that they do.
Elaine, give us an idea of what actually happens when the US government shuts down.
Well, the first thing that happens is that all non-essential employees are furloughed. Usually in past shutdowns, the military has been exempt and some parts of Homeland Security. So there's some parts of the government that are called essential. There's mostly safety and security, but many of them have to go to work without pay. And as you can imagine, that is not a good option for most people, right? When the shutdowns are 1 to 3 days, it's no big deal. They get their back pay. But as the 2018-2019 shutdown showed, that was a month. So that was a month where people who issue these fishing licenses in Alaska, as Rina just talked about, and other things, are not being paid. And so it's very detrimental to the morale of the workers, and it just slows everything down. There's all sorts of things that cannot be done. People waiting for permits, people waiting for passports. You can't get passports. You can't get visas. All of that is shut down. So it's very detrimental, not to mention the grant making process. What people don't understand about the U.S. federal government is a lot of it is just sending money to states and localities and to nonprofits that are doing things like drug counseling or mental health counseling. All of that shuts down. So there is an enormous ripple effect throughout the country, throughout the economy, when there's a government shutdown.
Thomas, it's just not an effective way to govern, is it?
That's right. Absolutely not. I mean, this helps no one. Americans want a government that functions, and this isn't a government that functions. But beyond sort of just the general ripple effects, it creates huge uncertainty in the markets. And of course, the last thing Wall Street wants to see is uncertainty. We already saw with the last brinkmanship over the debt ceiling, Fitch downgraded the U.S. Credit rating. So that has long-term implications for the servicing of the debt. You know, fewer people are going to want to invest. This has sort of broader implications for the U.S. economy. So, no, this isn't a government that is working. It's not what Americans elected the representatives to Washington to do. And I think to a large extent, it's a failure. It's dysfunction, which we've unfortunately been seeing go on for quite some time.
Rina, as Thomas was saying, Fitch downgraded the US credit rating in August, and when it did that, it noted a steady deterioration in governance over the last 20 years. This is pointing to what you were saying earlier about performance politics in Congress. The Republican parties, the divisions there, the partisanship between the Republicans and the Democrats has reached such a high level that it is, again, it's just not effective, is it? It is not delivering to Americans what Americans deserve to have, which is a fully functioning government.
In a representative democracy like ours, it's very important for people to feel represented. But of course, we've got high levels of dissatisfaction with our elected officials across the board. People are feeling more and more that Congress is not only out of touch with them, but Congress does not represent their interests. So there's systemic reforms that can make Congress better, but a lot of them have not been widely accepted. Things like term limits, things like gerrymandering. We have the state issue. States have to act and do things in a certain manner that can square up and make the federal government more effective, the way I see it. But also having big money in our elections is hugely consequential. What we see that does is give lots of power to the incumbent. On the Senate side, you see octogenarians are becoming almost a norm. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, who has had many an illness, is and also leader of the Republicans in the Senate. Senator Mitch McConnell, who is frozen at the podium and looked like he's had more than just what would be considered a senior moment twice this year. These are the people that are representing us. And so you've got millennials and Gen Z, those born after 1981, who are increasingly frustrated because of the way of life that those sitting in Congress have enjoyed for years is not being enjoyed by us. That is home ownership. That's the ability to scale the socioeconomic ladder. And these problems are being put on Congress's inability to work together, to compromise. Now, of course, as a former Hill aide, I know that to get anything done on Capitol Hill, one must reach across the aisle and shake hands with the other side. So I am encouraged by one development related to this shutdown. As the situation gets worse for McCarthy on the one hand, and he's running out of room from his Senate allies, there is a group of conservatives in the Senate that are tired of deferring to Kevin McCarthy, and they want to see a vote on legislation that would automatically impose stopgap spending patches, and that would permanently prevent shutdowns. Now, that's the kind of reforms and solutions I want to see that are come out of Congress, but we see less and less of these, and there's no hope or encouragement that they will continue to create these type of solutions. I do hope this one passes, because these shutdowns are not just a sign of the times, they've become very normalized. And to just be at the 11th hour to see the negotiation happen at the very last minute for years on end doesn't give me any faith or restore it in the institution of Congress.
Elaine, do you agree with that proposal for automatic stopgap funding, which of course would stop the government from shutting down? But would it not also just allow Congress to do what it does very well, which is procrastinate and kick the can down the road and not make any firm decisions on its negotiations?
I think that's a very good idea. I can't see the Republicans in the House going for it. I mean, I think one of the things I think of foreign audiences need to understand is just how, as we say in English, the tail is wagging the dog when it comes to this Congress, right? There are, in fact, a very small number of Freedom Caucus members and an even smaller number on the House Rules Committee who are dictating things that go against what the vast majority, Democrats and Republicans in the House, would like to do. The Senate has shown that it is possible to make a compromise between these two sides. And yet this group that is really nihilistic, they want to burn the House down, they're in control somehow. Somebody's got to stop that, okay? Whether it's Kevin McCarthy, whether it's Kevin McCarthy losing his speakership because of it, somehow that has to be stopped. This is not the way democratic governments work, where a very small minority gets to call the shots. And somehow the Republicans have gotten themselves into this fix, and somebody's got to get them out of it.
Thomas, do you have any answers here? How the whole of America cannot be held ransom by this small group of individuals?
Well, it's very difficult. And again, I'll just go back to the fact that a lot of this is just an institutional feature of how Congress works. Of course, senators and representatives in the House are elected in two different ways. Basically, senators, you have two senators per each state, whereas for the House members, they're really representing just a small district. And at the state level, gerrymandering has become so rife, essentially the creation of safe seats in which both Democrats as well as Republicans essentially face no real challenger in general elections, or at least in a lot of these places, they don't feel any real challenge. And so the only challenge that they're likely to face is from either the right flank or the left flank of their party. So they have every incentive to move toward the polls. When you combine that with the rise of out-of-state money, and just the rise of money generally, which has become sort of essentially incentivize politicians to court sort of ideologically pure interests, low turnout primaries, all these things I think add up to a situation where you get these representatives that are just sort of voicing the opinions of a small niche of Americans and aren't doing a very good job at sort of representing the whole of the country.
And Rina, you mentioned earlier that voters are becoming increasingly disenfranchised with this performance politics in Congress. This is an important election year coming up, 2024. How do you think this behaviour that we're seeing on Capitol Hill at the moment is going to impact the Republican voter?
It's remains yet to be seen what the genuine impact would be, because it takes a lot of time to make its way down. But we have to look at the facts. The Republicans have a threadbare majority in the House, and the fate of that really rests on 18 incumbents that are sitting in turf that's pretty friendly to President Joe Biden. And so, unlike in deep red districts, there needs to be compromise to end a crisis that is actually really unpopular. And like I alluded to earlier, I believe that the average voter can see this for what this is: the representative failing to get something done for them, regardless of what that representative's stripes are. So the stakes are extremely high. Republicans have had control of the House for, barely 9 months. And so with that little power under their belt, a little amount of time of having power under their belts, there's really a lot on the line here in how their constituents can see them moving forward. But more so, I think it's about the issues. There's so many kitchen table issues, is what we call them here, that are more important to the average voter as we grow closer to electing who will be our next occupant of the White House. With things like the economy, core inflation is talked about quite a bit, but it doesn't feel like either side wants to address that crisis also of housing as well. That's always a looming crisis. But in reality, politics is a feeling, right? And if you feel that things are not going well for you, you're more likely to punish those who essentially have the reins of power right now. And this shutdown could be a huge stain on the face of Republicans, because it will look like it was the Republicans who forced it, caused it. And again, the blame will rest on them.
Dan, Elaine, sorry, do you agree with that these Republican divisions can only help the Democrats' election prospects, even if a shutdown does hurt Americans, if it's prolonged and it starts to affect the economy on top of already inflation and strikes and all the other ills that are affecting America?
No, absolutely. Look, we know from history that the in the most recent shutdowns, the Republican Party has suffered in public opinion and electorally because of their tendency to try to take this to the wire and cause a shutdown. But there's something else happening too. Usually, political parties have a sort of clear idea of what success means, and success means winning in a general election. There's a piece of this Republican Party that insists on recruiting far-right candidates. And what we saw in the 2022 election was that the Trump wannabes, the far-right candidates, guess what? They lost in the general election. And so far in 2023, when we look at special elections at the state legislative level or, lower down that don't get that much national attention, guess what? The same thing is happening. So there will come a point when the behavior of the Freedom Caucus, what they're imposing on the Republican Party, when people say this is too costly to us. And somehow people are going to have to confront the fact that they are losing because of the actions of this smaller group of people on the far right. And once they do that, then I think we may return to somewhat more of a normal Republican Party. But right now, this is not a normal situation.
Rina, last word to you. Do you think that will happen sooner rather than later?
I really don't know where we stand right now because I think it's a most unusual moment. It's not a game of chess; it's a game of checkers, as it's been said by House Republican just this past week. I mean, this is not sophisticated. This isn't complex. This is literally a moment in which you're seeing some very extreme members hold some members hostage, and this is not how I believe our government at its highest level should work. So, though I am dissatisfied right now, I am hopeful that something could be possible. But right now, we are barreling towards that shutdown, and I don't think it would be very short. But I do think it makes us look weak on the world stage, particularly when it comes to our defense spending. So, as somebody who wants to see America put first time and again, I think our lawmakers should put their heads together, do the right thing, and maybe work on a creative solution or two.
Well, we'll be certainly revisiting this subject again over the coming week, maybe weeks. It's a very busy week ahead in Congress. Thanks very much to our guests for joining us today, Rina Shah, Thomas Gift and Elaine Kamarck. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.